All right, good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to the panel that we're having on inequality and mobility in America. The panelists we have here today are Jared Bernstein, Economic Policy Fellow at the Milken Institute, a Senior Fellow on the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the former Chief Economist to Vice President Joe Biden, and many, many other things. Edward Conard, the author of Unintended Consequences. He was a former Senior Managing Director at Bain Capital. Robert Doar, Fellow in Poverty Studies, American Enterprise Institute, former Commissioner, Human Resources Administration at the City of New York. And Chrystia Freeland, Member of Parliament in Canada, author of the book Plutocrats, The Rise of the New Global Super Rich and the Fall of Everyone Else. Sounds ominous. So I thought we'd start off the panel today and talk about, it's clear, we're not going to show a lot of statistics on the trend of inequality. I think it is clear that in the United States, inequality in terms of incomes and wealth has certainly been in a rising trend for the last at least couple of decades. What we want to talk about is some of the causes, some of the effects, and maybe some of the potential solutions. I think I'll start off on the right here, and Jared, I'll start with you let's start from an economic point of view. Let's look at it as a two-part question, causes and effects. What do you see from an economist point of view have been the contributors to this rise in inequality? And on effects, is this something that is simply relative outcomes have changed? Or are people from the middle on down actually on an absolute basis having their life negatively affected?
Okay. And I think we're generally focusing on the U.S. case.
Yes, in the U.S.
In the U.S., okay. The relative absolute part is a little different in Europe. So economists have, for decades now, since this has been an ongoing trend, scratched our heads about the causes. And I would say if you would have pull an economist out of a hat,
which is quite a trick.
Yeah, which is a good thing to do. She will say technology and globalization are the two driving factors. And there's certainly something to that. Globalization, by increasing the supply of labor that's competitive in our country versus those with much lower pay scales. We've certainly, I think it's widely agreed that while globalization is a net plus in many ways, it certainly hurt the employment and earnings opportunity of many of our non-college educated workers. And then speaking of college education, there's an argument that as technology has evolved, its complementarity with the skills of the most highly skilled workers has led to an educational premium. Those are the conventional things. I like to go much further than that because I actually think technology in particular isn't as important a factor as people say it is because it's been such an ongoing and structural driver of these trends. More importantly are things that kind of changed around the late 1970s when the inequality really began to take off. You don't see it as much from the graphs of the Gini coefficient, but if you look at the concentration of income or wealth at the top, you see it quite clearly. And what happened? Well, post-mid-70s, we ran much slacker labor markets. That's probably the wrong way to use the word slack. A lot of slackers. A lot more slack in the job market. That is, the unemployment rate was at or below the full employment rate 70% of the time in the kind of growing together period of the post-war years, and only 30% of the time in the years of growing inequality. So much more slack in the job market. At risk of offending a lot of my friends who are here at the Institute, financialization is a source of increasing inequality. The fact that more of our resources are devoted to a sector that has very high levels of unequal pay. And then more recently, some of the work of Thomas Piketty is very popular these days. He focuses on this. The very large salaries, I think Chrystia's written about this as well, the very large salary of the, quote, super managers, folks at the very top of the pay scale, that actually explains 2/3 of the growth in the concentration of income in the top 10%. So that's the list off the top of my head, Alan.
Okay, and the second part.
Oh, I didn't get to the second part. So the second part of the question, I think that there have been quite clear absolute impacts. There was a very nice piece in the New York Times the other day using data from the Luxembourg income study comparing actual growth, so absolute, growth in real incomes at low, middle, and high percentiles. And it shows that relative to, not relative, compared to all of our other countries, because again, these are absolute trends in real dollars, the incomes at the median have been flat, at the 20th percentile, the 10th percentile, they've been falling. And this is just a very simple arithmetic thing. When you've got a certain amount of growth, whether it's more growth, we've certainly grown faster than many of those economies, but that growth gets channeled to the top of the scale, you're going to have sticky poverty rates. That's an absolute measure. So we have higher and more entrenched poverty, and you're going to have weaker growth of wages. In a relative sense, we've also seen some real deprivation in terms of, and this is very important, we're getting into the impact of inequality. The opportunities for, say, kids on the have-not side of the equation, the educational opportunities, the enrichment goods that their parents invest in their well-being, the kind of things that, parents like me invest in our kids, the inability of them to invest in their children, give them a relative disadvantage as well. So I think it's both, Alan.
Okay, so Ed, let me go back and I want to get at what are the economic causes. Yep. I think that Jared covered a lot of them, although some of it is what causes the ability for top managers to get higher pay, and so from an economist point of view, I want to get to the causes and also the relative impacts versus the absolute impacts.
Before I do that, which I'll do in 1 second, just pop up slide 16, please, which is the data that he refers to, that he says has flat wages since 1980. Do we have that? This is the slide that was in the New York Times. It shows you the growth in incomes. The United States is the red line. The next line is Germany. The next line is France. So just so people don't have any misunderstanding of data, if you look at the median, which I circled in blue, the United States has grown at the same rate as France and Germany have. At the lower levels, it's pretty much the same rate. All of the growth has come at the high end. It has not been flat by the Luxembourg income study.
Sorry.
If you flip to the next slide.
Let me just say, wait.
This is the data that's in the New York Times.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. And I did specify.
Do you want to debate the data that's on the chart?
He's exactly right. And the reason was I was talking about since 2000. And I should have been specified that. Since 2000.
Flip up the next slide, please.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, here you go. Since 1980 to 2010, part of the reason why the New York Times uses 1980 and not 1990 is because Europe and Japan were catching up to the United States after World War II, and since 1990, the U.S. has really taken off relative to Europe and Japan. And so I put Germany and France here because they were two of the most biggest data points in the graph. You can see that the U.S. has risen substantially relative to Germany and France since 1990. And it's true that all the incomes have been relatively flat since 2000. But Germany, which has had the fastest growth, really has had the flattest wages of all of these. So Jared, I think, does raise some points. I feel that things get conflated between what's driving income at the top and what's causing wage pressure in the middle. At the top, I think there's no doubt that information technology and a combination of that access to global markets has really created a shortage of properly trained talent in the United States. It's driven up wages. If you really dig down and look at the wages at the top, CEO wages have not risen faster than the wages of the 0.01%. If you look at the 0.01%, the wages have broadly distributed grown at very similar rates. And most of those people are guys like partners in law firms who are competing with other partners and other law firms to try to get customers to pay them more, and they're competing out in the marketplace to hire talented people to work for them. And so they are earning their increases in pay. They are not CEOs going to their boards and getting their boards to pay them more at the expense of shareholders. When you look at the pay of CEOs, public company CEO pay has not risen relative to private company CEO, and neither of them, public or private, have risen relative to the rest of the 0.1%. So I think what you really see is opportunity costs, a real opportunity relative to a shortage of labor. And that shortage is especially acute because Europe and Japan have not been able to produce the IT innovation anywhere near the level of IT innovation that the US has. It's the only place in the world you can really go to for leadership in that level of innovation. What's happened in the middle income at the same time? There's been a massive increase in the supply of labor, which has put pressure on the wages, independent of what's going on at the highest end. So there were a number of trends, forces that were increasing pay at the middle. One, there was a dearth of births in the Great Depression. So coming out of World War II, you had a shortage of labor. We saturated the population with education. It greatly increased the productivity. Technology hollowed out agriculture, and we had migration to the cities where people are much more productive. We had a large growth in capital-intensive manufacturing jobs. Today, technology is hollowing out manufacturing, and all of those forces have run their course. What's left in their place is that we had an enormous baby boom, which increased the supply of labor. We had a big increase in the participation of women, which increased the supply of labor. On top of that, we're running about $500 billion a year of non-energy trade deficits, which translates into millions of jobs being exported overseas, probably more than 5 million jobs being exported overseas, and we absorbed an enormous wave of immigration to the United States, largely at the low skill level. Today we have 37 million foreign-born adults. We have 16 million native-born adult children of foreign-born parents. So on a population of a little over 300 million people, we have about 53 million people in the country from this wave of immigration. Don't kid yourself that it hasn't put pressure on middle income wages and unskilled wages in our country. So what is the only force that is driving up wages today relative to the world wage, which is constantly exerting pressure, pulling our unskilled and middle income wages back to the world wage? The only thing is increases in local demand, and that is chiefly today coming from the outsized success of the 1% in the United States relative to the success of Europe and Japan. And that increase in growth can manifest itself in two ways. One is as an increase in wages, and the second is as an increase in employment. And what we have seen over the last 20 years is a massive increase in employment in the United States relative to Europe and Japan. U.S. employment grew 50% since 1980. Europe, Germany and France, less than half as much. Japan, less than a third, almost only a quarter of the growth in the United States, which means our growth has been double France's and Germany's in terms of employment. Today, despite this enormous increase in the supply of labor, we have 20 to 25% more hours of work per working age adult than they have in Germany and France. And we have been able to achieve this at income levels which are about 20 to 25% higher than Europe and Japan's median income levels. And I just would remind you that if it were not for the skewed contribution of U.S. innovation, the growth in Europe and Japan would be even slower relative to the United States than it is today, and it's shockingly slow relative to the United States. So I'd say this: had we restricted the supply of labor, we could have much higher middle income than we have had as a result of the massive increase that we've had. And so I would summarize it in this way. The left has done a brilliant job of blaming the success of the 1% for the slow growth of middle incomes. If that were truly the case, if it was truly the case that income inequality was bad for the middle class, we would not have seen the outsized growth in employment that we saw in the United States relative to Europe and Japan. Quite the opposite. Their more equally distributed incomes, their economies would have grown faster than ours. Ours grew way faster than theirs. And so I would be careful not to damage the one thing that is producing growth in the United States in this high-wage economy, and that's the outsized success of America's 1% or America's 0.01%, however you want to measure it. And I think that Europe and Japan show us how hard it is in this environment to grow high-wage economies, and how hard it is to motivate an entrepreneurial class in their economies where they have been singularly unsuccessful in being able to duplicate what we've done in the United States. And so I just say those are cautionary tales, and before you blame the success of the 1% and you do damage to that success, you ought to recognize where the real growth has come from and the success we have had in increasing middle and lower income job creation, and we've been able to do that at wages which are significantly higher than Europe and Japan, and we've been able to grow them at the same rate despite this enormous increase in the supply of labor.
So that covered a lot of ground very succinctly, but it did it very well. So Ed, what you're saying, I just want to see if I get it, because actually I asked about economics, about to shift to some things, and some of these issues are social and cultural as well as economic, as to how people are allowed to be paid and who gets to vote on that and things like that. And then there gets to be regulation. So what you're saying if I could just summarize for a bit, because I'm going to shift over here to some of the social and cultural, is you're saying that the difference between the U.S. and other developed world economies competing in this global marketplace.
At this point in time, yes.
At this point in time is that the one differentiator of the U.S. is the degree of success of the innovative part of the economy, which has driven a lot of the success of the very high-end wage earners, has actually been a force that has helped lift the middle of the economy more so than the economies that are similar to ours but don't have that magnitude of success. Is that?
Absolutely, and I don't see how you can see it any other way, because I see a lot of comparisons to the 1950s when circumstances were very different, comparisons to the 1990s when the NASDAQ went from 800 to 4,500, and say, why can't we produce growth equal to the 1990s? Why haven't we been able to produce growth equal to the 1950s? Because the circumstances are completely different. You have to make comparisons to other high-wage economies at this point in time to see the real relative success of the U.S. and to be able to understand it.
So you're saying economically, and that's what I want you to give, economically, the extraordinary success of the 1/10% is a net positive for the rest of the members.
Absolutely.
Economically in the society.
And I will show you other data later as we get here on mobility, which if it was a problem for the middle class, we'd see mobility slowing down. We have seen no reduction in mobility. And when you make comparisons to pop-up slide 18, for example, when you make comparisons to the US versus Denmark, Denmark is one of the most equally distributed incomes in the whole world, but certainly in Europe. And what this is showing you is the probability if you're in the bottom fifth that you can get from the bottom fifth, you remain in the bottom fifth, you get from the bottom fifth to the top fifth, or if on the other end of the spectrum, if you're in the top fifth, what's the probability you end up in the bottom fifth or you end up in the top fifth? What you see is that US mobility is almost identical to Denmark, except at the bottom 20%. And at the bottom 20%.
Let's pause there. We're going to come back to it because we're going to have a discussion of mobility. One sentence, that's it.
One sentence. You see lower test scores, higher dropout rates, disintegration of two-parent families, higher crime rates. You can blame those things on economics, and perhaps it is economics which is causing those things, but you at least ought to open your mind to the fact that there might be other reasons for the kinds of problems that we're seeing in the bottom 20% of the income distribution of the United States and the effect that it's having on social mobility.
That's good. I want to switch to my left here. This isn't the right and the left, as you can tell, from any other reason except,
but I'm going to have a chance
my hand.
I'll have a chance to rebut.
I sense that Jared is not accepting that there is no other explanation.
I don't believe in trickle down, and we'll have a lot of
I think we're going to come back to that. But this actually, we're going to get to mobility too, but I want to get to my left over here, and I want to shift a little bit from the economic causes, because I think any of these things, the outcomes are based both on economics and social mores and cultural aspects and things of that nature. So I'd like to shift a little bit to the social side, if I could, and the cultural side, and I'm going to split that in half between the two, because Chrystia, I'd like you to talk about what do you see as the causes as a society besides the economics that have helped foster this inequality, and how do you see it affecting the middle class?
So, first of all, thank you guys. That was a fascinating discussion. And I think, Alan, you're focusing on the issue that all of us, regardless of how familiar we are with the data, are really kind of feeling in our gut. And when we look at the Piketty book and we see that this 600-page book written originally in French, full of data, is at the top of the bestseller list, I don't think it's because we've all become wonkish. I think it's because a lot of people are feeling that something is different. Something is different in America, something is different in Western industrialized societies from the kinds of societies that we grew up in, and the societies which I think sort of intuitively are what we think of as the normal. That post-war era when we had high growth and also actually declining income inequality. I still think that sort of in our lizard brains, that's how we think Western industrialized democracies work, and things are really different right now. To me, the two most important areas to focus on in terms of their consequences are what the consequences are for mass democracy and citizenship, and what the consequences are for a sense of social opportunity. And on the consequences for citizenship, I wanted to read you guys a quote from Thomas Jefferson. And he was talking about...
From a book by your favorite author.
Well, no, but it's just, it happens to be where the quote is. And he was talking about the difference between America and Europe. We have no paupers. The great mass of our population is of laborers. Our rich, who can live without labor, either manual or professional, being few and of moderate wealth. Most of the laboring class possess property, cultivate their own lands, have families, and from the demand for their labor are enabled to extract from the rich and the competent such prices as enable them to be fed abundantly, clothed above mere decency, to labor moderately, and to raise their families. The wealthy, on the other hand, and those at their ease, know nothing of what the Europeans call luxury. They have only somewhat more of the comforts and decency of life than those who furnish them. Can any condition of society be more desirable than this? And that sort of sense of America being born of this essentially egalitarian social structure, I think is very fundamental to how, I mean, I'm now not an American speaking to you guys, I think it's fundamental to what makes you guys so great and to how you think about yourselves. And I think it's really fundamental to how American democracy was set up and has worked. And it's that sort of existential challenge, which is, I think, existential political challenge, which is one of the key things we have to grapple with. I think actually, you know, in the debate about what the causes of income inequality are, I think we can get kind of a little bit too wrapped up in that. You know, whether it's crony capitalism and bad guys who are either, you know, bamboozling their boards of directors or through strange financial schemes managing to become super rich, or whether it's fundamental positive, there you go, or whether it's fundamental positive economic drivers like the technology revolution and globalization. And actually, I'm inclined towards the fundamental economic drivers as what's causing it. But to me, the big kind of paradox and the question is, you know, if it is these fundamentally good economic forces like the technology revolution, like globalization, which are coming out with a social outcome that's very different from the one in which first American democracy and then in the post-war era, democracy in the Western industrialized countries was created, how are we going to keep these things in balance? And then maybe in closing, just a couple of thoughts on opportunity and mobility. That part, I think, is absolutely key, and that's a key answer to this question of how we keep things in balance. You know, so if the drivers are these fundamental economic forces, and if the outcomes are a much more unequal society, really, than America has had for most of its history, and that the Western democracies have had for most of their histories, how do we keep society going? How do we keep the social contract? If you can have equality of opportunity, that's surely going to be a key. And what I really worry about there is something that both Jared and Ed alluded to, which is this huge differentiation into where people are at the starting line. So Ed has pointed to problems in the US bottom fifth, and those are certainly there, and I think we're going to hear more about them in a minute. And then at the same time, what's happening is in the top quintile or in the top decile, we're all investing a huge amount in our kids. You know, according to one study, people in the top quintile, we're not talking about the plutocrats, we're just talking about the upper middle class, spend $7,000 more per child on after-school activities per year than everybody else. And look, like, I have 3 kids. I am totally focused on their education, and I'm sure everybody here is too. We're not going to stop doing it, and we're not doing it because, I don't think we're doing it because we're crazy or we're morons. We're doing it because we think that's a really necessary investment. And so that's where I think we have to focus and try to figure it out. And it's going to be really, really hard. It's an educational arms race, and everybody in this room is putting their kids way ahead of everybody in that bottom quintile.
So what's interesting about that, if what Ed said is true, and I think the data says it, it would really imply that in the countries where the education is much more equal, then that would help the bottom 20%, but actually wouldn't change the needle for the rest of the 80%, is I think what you were basically saying. But so what's interesting then is to turn to that 20%, Robert, where you spent your life. And let me ask you this way, I'll switch the gears a little bit. The poverty rate has been relatively unchanged. One could argue that millions and millions of competitive workers on a globalized basis at the bottom of the scale could have suggested our poverty rate should be rising, all other things being equal. But poverty rate is one of these things that's it's a line, and the conditions of what is like below that line isn't always the same, especially in different parts of the country over different eras. So, the question for you, since you're an expert on people in this area, over the last couple of decades or so of rising inequality, have things on an absolute basis remained stagnant for the bottom 20, or the bottom half or part of the economy, or have they gotten worse?
Well, to the extent that the economy is growing and we have productive economics in New York City, for instance, the bottom part of the income scale does better, whether or not inequality is rising dramatically or not. And I think that's an important point that needs to be made, is that these issues are different issues, and solutions or efforts to address one might not accrue to the benefit of another. And certainly that was part of the balance that we struggled with in New York City under Mayor Bloomberg with welfare programs and with balancing what we were trying to do in the city. We wanted to preserve a strong economy so we could preserve opportunities for entry-level jobs and all kinds of jobs. But we also wanted to keep our eye on the entire sort of culture of the city. One of the things that I think is under-recognized in discussing inequality and poverty, and I would like to go to chart 20, is the extent to which we support low-wage workers with a whole array. This doesn't directly go to that, but a lot of that is array of supports for workers with health insurance.
Flip up the next chart.
And the next one as well, health insurance, earned income tax credit, transfer payments in the welfare programs, so that not just non-workers, but workers as well, wages can be higher and can allow them to survive and do better in a city like New York than they would just on wages. So I think that's very important. So when you ask what's happening at the bottom, one of the things that's happening that I don't think gets enough recognition is the extent to which we are maximizing the return for work when balanced correctly by supplementing low wages with government supports, that sometimes in the overall discussion, I think, gets ignored. The other thing that's happening...
Would you argue that that's made conditions better?
Yes, I would argue that...
Would you argue it across the United States? Now, New York City is at a very strong recovery in its economy, and it is a part of the economy that has really participated. Is that true, the things you're talking about, true for poverty in Appalachia and places like that?
If you don't have a growing and prosperous economy creating jobs, you can't supplement low wages with income supports, with work supports. I recognize that. But those income supports that we provide in those circumstances, the combination of work with support is better than no work. And so all I'm trying to point out is not only are we shoring up wages at the bottom, but unless we have, to the extent that we address inequality in ways in which that accrues to negatively affect the economy, we are going to undermine this work and work support situation we have for the poor. The other thing that I think needs to be recognized, and now we're going to talk about cultural issues or other issues outside of the economy, is the extent to which children born in single-parent families face much greater challenges and much greater likelihoods for not succeeding in various ways of measuring their success. And that is an issue that deserves great attention. And when I think about being an anti-poverty fighter or a commissioner of social services in New York City, and I'm thinking about, well, what are the things we're going to work on today, focusing on the top end of the income scale and saying they're making too much, and not focusing on issues concerning family formation and education seems to me to be a distraction. And I try to stay in the job that I was in for the mayor, focused on what really was going to help people in need. And with regard to sort of attitudes, my perception in New York City, and I could be wrong, is that the gap between the poor and the upper middle class to the poor didn't look too much different than the gap between the poor and the super rich. I mean, me and whoever else out here is in that crowd, to the poor don't look too different. And I'm not so sure they were walking around concerned about that. What they were concerned about is jobs, the availability of jobs, and their ability to access income supports that could make their wages go further.
Okay, we got a lot to cover, but Jared, you've been very calm over there, and I sense that you.
I'm a calm guy.
Yes, you are, but I sense you took some exception and you started to on some
of it, but
Ed
not.
said on whether or not. It seemed to me where it was on whether or not the rise in inequality, which has definitely been a great thing for the very top end of the scale, has it been a net positive or a net negative for
Correct.
those at the middle on down?
So that's the part that I definitely strongly object to, and I'll get to that in a second. But I do think that Ed has a point in the sense that we don't want this discussion to morph into something that casts undue aspersion on people who are responding to incentives and innovators and people who know how to take advantage of the tax code and people who are smart investors and so on. So I'm not at all trying to disparage the top X% at all. I think it's a very peculiar view of history to argue that somehow income concentration has redounded to the benefit of lower income people. I mean, that I don't think the data supports at all. I think it was Chrystia who mentioned that if you actually look at income trends from the mid-40s to now, you find that the incomes of lower, middle, and high-income people all doubled in the post-war era from, say, the mid-40s to the mid-70s. They all grew by a little more than 100%. Productivity was particularly strong in those years. GDP was stronger. Unemployment was much lower. That was the period, as I mentioned earlier, of full employment. If you then compare those indicators to the latter period when inequality was so pervasive, this notion of trickle-down absolutely disappears as the fairy dust that I really think it is. GDP growth was slower, so I don't get your innovation point. Productivity growth was slower, so I don't get your innovation point. Job growth was notably slower. Unemployment was notably higher, so I certainly don't accept your employment report. So on macro indicators, definitely not. And on living standards indicators, income, as I mentioned, grew by doubled in those periods. And while Ed definitely has a point, and it's wrong to say, as some people on my side of the argument say, nobody got any growth in these years. That's wrong. Incomes did grow. And in fact, if you look at his slide, I think, what slide was it, Ed, that you had from the Luxembourg thing?
16.
17, actually. 17. Look at 17. 16
will show you same thing over broader income.
No, but I want to see 7 because I want to show that the problem with the earlier chart is it just takes endpoints. I want to show this is from 1980 to 2020. Look at the median income per capita of the US. And it's pretty flat in the 80s, not totally flat, pretty flat in the 80s, very flat in the 2000s. In fact, it grew 0.3% between 2000 and 2010, 0.3% in 10 years compared to 20%.
2000 is a peak. So
2000 and 2010 compared to Germany, about 19%.
You're going from a peak
France,
to a trough.
19%. Where you see the growth there, by the way, is in the latter 1990s when we actually ran a full employment economy. And that did have important demand side effects. But somehow I've not heard anyone, including today, convincingly somehow make this argument that inequality has been good for the middle class. I mean, you might argue that it hasn't been bad. But I think it has been bad, but
Jared,
not good.
Let me interrupt because I think something that Ed said I want to reiterate, and then maybe so he doesn't have to just say it again. So one of the issues whenever we compare the post-World War II period in any way, we can romantically look at things, but you look at China today, and as they are taking people off of farms and putting capital behind them and putting them into factories, they are dramatically raising living standards. They have dramatic growth. But that's going to run its course at some point. And all of the post-World War II economies in the free world, the non-communist parts of the country, all had very large growth rates as they came out of world wars and depression and put their labor to work
But that's a
with new
macroeconomic
machinery. But that was something. How can we compare? I think the question is, how do you compare what happened in a completely different period now to the developed world? Do you have to compare
We can compare
the
by
developed world to the undeveloped, to the building the infrastructure world of post-World War II, or do we compare it to each other?
I think you compare. I think you compare. I think you both make a very important point, which I accept. But I also think that your point, and here I'm just comparing periods of American history. American economic history, I think what you compare is what you're really talking about to me is macroeconomic growth and productivity growth. Top line macroeconomic statistics that very much you have productivity gains based on precisely the scenarios that you two outlaid that are much greater in this developing period than in the more recent period. That doesn't speak to the distribution of growth. That speaks to the aggregate. It's the distribution that
well,
we're
it
so
may
upset
speak
about.
to it as it relates to the type of growth, like manufacturing jobs that give way to other types of jobs. But let's get off that for a second, because we have to cover mobility, and then we have to try and get at solutions. And this thing could go on for a long time, which is intriguing. But if you can respond quickly, because I want to switch.
Bob Solow won the Nobel Prize for measuring productivity gains, and he really broke it into three: capital per worker, education, and innovation. And if you look at the growth rates in the past versus today, capital per worker and education were contributing much more to productivity growth in the past than they are today. And innovation today has picked up the slack. So you can't just make a comparison to the past and say, hey, growth is slower. Yeah, growth is slower. But innovation is the one thing that has kept the growth rate up in the United States, as the other two factors have dropped off. And this, I
agree that innovation is great.
Second thing I'd say is this. The United States.
Okay, we all agreed. Let's go get it.
In the United States, the top 1% earns 18% of the income which is earned by labor. In Germany, it's 12%. Okay? And yet, when you look at the two countries, the 99% earns 47% of GDP in both countries. How can that be? Because capital has increased its share, its earning share of GDP, way more in Germany, France, and Japan than it has in the United States. And in fact, almost all of the gain in the 1% of the United States appears to be coming from taking share from the gains that capital have been able to achieve in other economies. And it's not surprising when you think about what drives growth, because there's two binding constraints in the U.S. economy: properly trained talent and equity to underwrite the risk of innovation. Those two things bump up against constraints, and when they're competing with each other, capital, the talented 1%, is able to say to investors, I'm taking a bigger share of the gains, because without me, you don't get any gains. And in the rest of the world, where their 1% hasn't been anywhere near as productive as our 1% has been, they're much more dependent on capital for growth. And the effect of it has been, whether you look at France, Germany, or Japan, okay, their 99% is earning about the same percent of GDP, 47% in the most successful economies, US and Germany. It's about 50% in France, maybe 51% in Japan.
Okay,
and they've all come down dramatically.
Capital versus labor brings Pinchetti back in.
Right. But it's not that we've taken it from the middle class.
I want to bring Pinchetti back in a different way, though. I'm going to call an audible on him. So I want to say, because I want to touch on mobility, and for the sake of time, I want to touch on two aspects of mobility at once and see how each of you think, or jump in at any of you think. Point number one is, has mobility, has the ability to move from the bottom to the top, or the bottom 20 to the top 20, and all those issues, has mobility, because it's not just inequality that affects people, it's the feeling of whether or not it's a fair game, right? And so has mobility stayed roughly the same, or has it decreased? Second, has the perception of mobility, which may be more important to social cohesion, and that's why I bring up your point, Chrystia. If Pinchetti is the hottest thing on the bestseller list, I mean, a French economist on the bestseller list, give me a break, right? So if that's the top of the bestseller, is that because innately everybody's saying, I knew it, it's no longer a fair game? So anybody could jump in on either one or both, but I want to try and cover them in a short period.
Yeah.
Even better than Piketty is Chetty's paper on mobility, and both of the papers, both on the extent to which it has not changed over a long period of time as inequality has grown, and the extent to which, while they go through 7 other things that had a weaker effect on mobility, and finally in the 8th, they tell which one was the biggest effect, which is the extent to which children are raised in communities where there are a lot of single-parent
Two-thirds.
two-parent families. So, the hottest book or the hottest paper or the hottest discussion of an important issue in America, I'd take Chetty's papers over.
So I want to come back to that 1 second, because that's a very important point. I just want to see, does anybody here think mobility is actually declining? That mobility is not what it was, that there is less opportunity, that you are more consigned to your parents' income level than your own opportunity?
Oh, now wait a second. I totally agree that mobility has been flat as per Chetty, and I think we have a slide on that. It's a boring slide because it's a line that goes just straight across. Now, I think there's, as far as opportunity, that's different, and there Chrystia made some points, and I would stress them as well. It's interesting that I think folks like Ed and to some extent Robert cite this stagnant mobility as a good thing, and it certainly is better than declining. I agree with that.
On the call, you said the study was disappointing. So I'm not sure it was we that called it a good thing.
I challenge you to find me calling the study disappointing, and
We were on
I think that's factually incorrect. Because it actually, I knew this was the case. I'd done a lot of research on this. It didn't surprise me. It was unsurprising. It wasn't disappointing. What I do think is a problem, and I'll be very quick, is that when you have just a much more varied income distribution, when the distance between the bottom and the top is a lot greater now than it was before, I think we would all agree, now than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. The distance from the low to the middle, from the middle to the much greater, you actually need faster mobility if you're going to increase opportunity. Because the antidote to higher inequality is higher mobility. If the floors of the apartment building are further apart, your elevator has to move more quickly to get from one to the other.
This is not the math. The math is laid out by Chetty in the study, okay?
Oh, Chetty agrees with this point.
But if you read the paper versus what he says in the media, you'll see that he says two very different things. In the paper, what this line says is that relative mobility has not changed. The probability,
no, it's true.
Bear with me, if you're in the bottom 20%, the probability you can get to the 80% is the same. But absolute mobility has increased. So the probability that anybody can now earn $100,000 has gone up over time, because as the ladder has separated, the probability of getting to any step on the ladder has stayed the same, and the steps in the ladder have higher incomes today. You can see that from the slide I put up earlier.
Factual disagreement.
Wait, go back.
We're going to resolve that.
Well,
I don't think we are going to resolve it, but I think that the issue...
Even Chetty agrees that absolute mobility is gone up.
Let me shift to the second point, because I actually think that perceptions can create reality based on how people behave. I also think that a lot of the stuff that we're talking about right now about family structure and opportunities that are created out of different family structures could in fact be leading indicators. I mean, we don't know, but we would not want to see that mobility was going to decline in a period like this, which we really have a problem. So I want to look at one of two things for anybody. One, do we think that society, that there are things going on in society that are threatening to the structure of society, and that the question is the perception? Because one of the things is everybody's about relative, right? If we can always say it doesn't matter how rich somebody is as long as you're doing okay, but when people see very rich, all of a sudden they think what they have is not as good. So if the perception of mobility, do people think that the game is rigged, and what impacts could that have?
So
Chrystia?
yes, clearly they do. And I mean, I think, as we've heard on the panel so far,
feel that?
what do I cite to see that people
what's
feel that?
What's your indication?
The election of Bill de Blasio in New York, the rise of Elizabeth Warren, the fact that Mitt Romney didn't win in 2012, the fact that being a successful businessman actually was a negative. Like, since when was that the case in America? I mean, I think that it's tremendously, I think that this whole debate around did the 1% get there, or the 0.1%, because they are virtuous, because they are talented, because they are super smart, or because they are crooks who have gamed the system, in some ways is a very sterile argument which misses the point. I mean, as it happens, I lean towards the superstar economics and the meritocracy argument. But however this new structure has been created, it is absolutely statistically clear, and it's clear to people who don't look at the data either, that income inequality has been surging in America and across the Western industrialized world, and it's also clear that it is less secure and less stable in the middle, that there is a hollowing out of jobs and opportunity, and even if your income hasn't fallen as much as people feel it's fallen, people certainly feel a lot less secure than they used to. They feel less secure in the wealth of their assets. You know, is their house going to still be valuable or not? And they feel less secure about having their jobs. And they feel less secure about, will their children do better than they did in the way that people felt of a previous generation certain that they would. And that together is a really, really big problem. And you know, I think that talking about absolutely family formation is important, but that's not going to be enough. I think there has to be a relentless focus on three things. One, doing everything you can to improve social mobility and opportunity. And I'm really with Jared on this one, that, you know, as the gap is bigger, it has to be easier and easier to get from the bottom to the top. Being same state isn't good enough because you see that gap is bigger. You need to have more and more meritocracy to get there. If you want to justify a society with huge disparity in wealth, it had better be almost as easy to get to the very top if you're born in poverty as being born in super wealth. So social mobility and opportunity, hugely important. Second thing that I think is hugely important that we haven't talked about is entrepreneurship. And I'm actually with Ed on this. I think it's a huge strength of America. All of us who aren't Americans look towards you guys for how entrepreneurial your society is. It's really important to extend that to people lower down and to really make entrepreneurship not just something that happens for the kids lucky enough to make it to Silicon Valley or to Ivy League universities, but to make that more of an opportunity for as many people as possible. And then the third thing, which maybe should be the first, is jobs, jobs, jobs. And that's about getting, you know, this is where Jared is absolutely right. If people have jobs, people feel that they can get them, they feel their jobs are secure, that is going to be hugely important. And I do worry, you know, secular stagnation, I don't think that case is totally proven and totally made. But I think there's a pretty good argument to be made that, you know, marginal propensity to consume is certainly higher at the bottom and at the middle than at the very top. And as you have more and more income being concentrated at the very top, is it a coincidence that we're seeing a slowing down of our economies?
So we were
one
almost going to have Larry Summers here, so I knew that you'd sneak him in somewhere.
I tried.
I'm going to hold one second, Robert.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you next, but I want to go to slide 28 because just for the sake of time, because I want to frame the last 10 minutes or so. Because I want to set the stage here a little bit by saying that, you know, this is not the first time. Not only are the 50s different from here, but we've gone through centuries and centuries. And if you go back and you look at what I think is a great book, The Lessons of History, it tells you that throughout time, there have been times where you get this inequality in societies as certain people do very, very well and others don't. And I want to point this out, that what we've learned from looking at this over and over and over throughout centuries, it says that in progressive societies, you get to a point where as long as the many poor and the many number rivals the strength of the ability and the few rich, then you get a critical situation. And history has diversely met that by legislation redistributing wealth or by revolution distributing poverty. And so what it says is basically you can only get unequal for so long, and if people perceive it's not fair, you've got to do something. And the history that they go through is the Greeks got it right. And by the way, I just want to say, redistribution does not necessarily mean tax the rich, right? Redistribution in there, that was the Greeks gave people some land to farm for themselves instead of having only certain people, and let them eat cake didn't work so well in France, right? So I want to get to this for this reason, and I want to get to you, Robert, is this will not continue, regardless of whether we think it's a good or bad thing. If society starts to think it's not a fair game, it will not continue. It doesn't matter what we think. So we got to get to how do we change it? And I want to go to that, some of these family structure and some of these issues. What are the ways we fix this?
Well, I don't know if I want to go back to family structure. I want to just say on the perception point, clearly in New York City did very well, you know, in the mobility chart that Chetty did for the whole country. New York City had very vibrant, there was a lot going on, but it also was unstable. And it did lead to people feeling that things were really moving fast, and that would lead to a perception of difficulty, even if there was mobility and opportunity going on. So I think that was happening. The second thing is sometimes I sit here when I think about these issues about inequality and compensation, is that everybody looks to the government guy for the government solution. And in a large respect, I was moved by the words in literature about corporate compensation issues and CEO compensation issues. And to the extent that we should be more transparent about that, and that corporate governance, I think, could take a little closer look at the ratios. And that's very not American Enterprise Institute language. I acknowledge that. But so I think there's an area we could go. But to go beyond that with something more dramatic like redistribution tax policy, I think could end up undermining the opportunities.
So one thing I will say is the one thing we seem to have everybody agreeing on is that while there's different perceptions of inequality and what it means and what it could imply, but everybody seems to say we have to make sure we do everything to drive the growth, right? This isn't just about, there's a bunch of people out there say the rich are doing fine enough, take it away from them. But if we did that in ways that didn't have the economy grow, I think everybody's saying that will actually have negative or unintended consequences. So for the last several minutes we have here, what do people think are the ways we can deal with driving the growth so that the overall pie is enlarging, and then what should we do about the ways to deal with how that pie is allocated?
So I think that's exactly the right question. I do think that our tax system could be somewhat more progressive without hurting growth, but I don't like the idea of legislating wealth redistribution. I don't. And by the way, while Piketty has recommends a fairly high tax on wealth, you know, he was careful to reject highly redistributive, Marxist kind of schemes. So I think the key is as follows, and I think it has to do with growth, but I think it has more to do with opportunity. When I put growth and opportunity together, I really end up with full employment with jobs for able-bodied people of working age. So I think the key to really dealing a blow to both the inequality problem, the mobility problem, and I mean stable mobility when we really need faster mobility, the opportunity problem, is a series of ideas which generates a lot more quality employment opportunities for people in, say, the bottom, 70%. Some of those ideas might be direct job creation. Some of them would have to do with lowering our persistent trade deficits. Some of them have to do with improving job quality, higher minimum wages. Some of them have to do with improving collective bargaining, more union power. There are a full set of fulsome ideas, but the idea is not to necessarily redistribute income or wealth. I think that's part of the solution. The idea is to redistribute opportunity through good employment.
So how do we do that? And Ed, you have an idea that relates to the trade deficit. So what do you want to cover that?
I'll say a couple of things before I get to the trade deficit. I think that leadership is critical, the leadership that unites us rather than divides us for political gain. And that I think that what we all want is what's best for the middle and the lower classes, and that we should recognize that's our objective. And that we ought to also recognize that the talents of mankind belong to mankind. They don't belong to the lucky recipients of those talents who get to cash them in at the right time and make a lot of money for that. And I think that should be our national policy and our national posture. But where that leads you, I believe, is that for our talented people, you have a moral obligation to get the training that's going to increase the growth and create the jobs that are beneficial to the U.S. economy and to the middle class and lower class. Our only way of motivating people to get that tough training, that calculus, that computer programming, when people want to study art history and English and other things that are a lot more fun to study, the only vehicle we have right now is pay. And we have pushed the pay button as far as we possibly can, and we still have a large shortage of people. Now, we had an opportunity to waste our talent when we were supplying 30% of the college graduates of the world. Today, we're contributing on net about 10%. We got to take our talented people and we have to make them feel a moral obligation to the rest of society to get the training and do the things that are necessary to do that. One of the things we could do, and then I'll go to the trade deficit, is H-1B visas. Okay, we could stop linking that to unskilled immigration, de-link it, and bring as many talented people into this country as we possibly can. We can skim the cream off the world. We can get every entrepreneur out there, and we are squandering our opportunity because the president won't budge on unskilled immigration. So I'd say separate them, and let's get the job done on that. And the second thing is the trade deficit at $500 billion puts enormous pressure on the middle class and the lower class. And we ought to back off on that. We ought to be pushing for balanced trade. We say we want all the trade in the world. We're happy to trade, but you buy a dollar from us, you sell a dollar. I mean, we buy a dollar from you, you buy a dollar from us. We're not going to let you buy assets instead of goods, the assets that don't employ our people. We are overflowing with risk-averse capital. We have no use for it at the moment. The only use we could find was giving it to subprime homeowners to consume it. It's not sustainable. The corn is sitting in the silo unused, and we're letting the rest of the world dump corn in our silos while our people are unemployed. And we have exported millions of jobs overseas as a result of running trade deficits. It's not trade, it's trade deficits. And that's the place where we can relieve a lot of pressure on our middle class. And we can do it quickly, and it'd be one of the biggest impacts we would have on the economy, and nobody talks about it left or right.
Any other solutions that we can look for? What are the things we should focus on? And we're going to have another panel another year to talk about some of these issues, because it was mentioned several times, and we can't get it, that besides economics, family structure and some of the incentive systems around family structure are having significant impacts that no matter what we do, we see as not moving the needle for a number of people who are born into situations where we cannot create the opportunities for
We have
them.
to keep talking about the consequences of raising children outside of two involved parents. We have to keep talking about it. It's not pleasant. It's not easy to talk about. We have to do that. And we have to watch the extent to which our transitional assistance programs or our assistance programs discourage work. I mean, there is an extent to which you can go where you're providing more assistance. The Affordable Care Act has some effects here where people will not work because they will lose a benefit that is more valuable to them in cash money than the additional dollar in earnings. That's something we should be careful about.
Can I offer, do you want to say more?
No, that's it.
Nope.
Okay, I'll do three quick ones. Ed, I think your demographics point is really good. And I would say to Americans, watch out, because we are in the market for smart immigrants. We actually, our immigration
Canada
minister,
bribes them to come there if they have $5 million
That's right.
in net worth.
No, our immigration minister gets in trouble if he doesn't hit his targets. And there's generally a social
Super high skilled
consensus.
Asian
We
immigration.
want to get more.
Canada's corner of the world.
I really believe that that is a key to growth in the future. It's a key to having a dynamic society. On the demographic point, I would also say make it easier for women to have kids and jobs. I think the specter of a totally aging society, like all becoming Japan, is not pretty. And you have to make it easier for women to do both. We have to be more of a feminist society that has real economic consequences. Second point, building on something Robert said, I think really, everybody in this room should be focused on how can you build a more inclusive capitalism in how you're running your own business. And that is in your personal interest as a human being and as someone who runs a business. I think given how big the gap is now, this is not an age when we can afford to just say the business of business is business. We have to go beyond shareholder value. And people at the very top have more of an interest than anyone else in the system continuing. So, devote 10% of your time to focusing on that. And third point, I would say something we touched on, this volatility in the economy that Robert in particular referred to, say in New York City. We have to remember that, Schumpeter's creative destruction feels very different if you're managing a $1 billion portfolio than if you are in the bottom quintile. Something George Soros said to me is, you can't diversify the portfolio of your job. It's really hard to diversify the portfolio of your personal training. And I think people who have the advantage of being, making money off of volatility, where you really can diversify. You need to have a little more emotional empathy for that big chunk of society for whom that is just not possible. And I think we are living in a much more volatile, faster economy. So it's more important to have some buffers, some social safety nets. I congratulate you guys for joining the rest of the civilized world and now having health care for everybody. I think that's a good thing psychically for people. I'm in favor of universal single payer. It's the way we do it. It's actually cheaper. But stuff like that makes things actually easier for people who are at the bottom and the middle and may be scared if they lose their job.
Well, we have run out of time, and we used the time well, and maybe we'll have part 2 next year, but I really want to thank you guys. It was a great panel, and thank you.